Welcome to Christ and Climate Change. The science and the statistics are clear about both the urgency and the devastation that climate change is causing. On average, it's estimated that $143 billion a year are the cost of climate change. I don't have to repeat this, that this is devastating. It threatens people's livelihoods. It threatens people's homes. Homes are wiped away. It threatens entire industry sectors. And worst of all, the climate crisis affects the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized. They're both the most affected and the first affected. The science is very clear that climate change is real, and yet faith is also what tells us that the climate change matters. And so, and yet, despite everything that we see, where does the God that the Bible tells us, the God that is right, the God that is just, the God that is truthful, who fights for the poor, cares for orphans and widows, who speaks for the oppressed, and where do we see this God in the midst of the climate crisis? So, if we turn to Exodus 3, which I'll be reading from, it says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames through a fire within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, and why the bush does not burn up. Then the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, and God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this point, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And I believe this is the first place that we should just take a moment and stop right here. The chapter goes on, but the thing to note here is that the very first thing God wanted to do, we're not even, this is happening in the middle of the Egyptians persecuting and enslaving the Jewish people. This is happening after Moses has killed a man, he's run away, and yet God wants to take a moment. He wants to take a moment to set everything else aside, to set aside performance metrics, to set aside his past, to set aside the circumstances that they were facing, and to just be present with him, to just be in the presence of an almighty and all-powerful, perfectly good and loving God. The first thing God calls him to do is to step outside the little moment in time that he's in, and to step into that infinite moment, per se, of God's beauty and vastness. Now, what's further fascinating about this is we see the Holy Spirit guiding Moses' heart. The Bible doesn't clarify whether or not this is the first time Moses had gone up the mountain. The Bible also doesn't talk about who else had gone up the mountain. But we do know that this was called Mount Horeb, or the mountain of God. And it's fascinating to see that Moses would go up this mountain. We don't know if it was the first time or the 50th. And yet that God would actually answer him. And that Moses would ask who God is, and God would say who he is. Verse 7 continues, The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, and Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So go now, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And again, the first thing God does is to just remind Moses that he is the all-powerful, that he is the infinite and eternal God. But God also, he's right there in the middle of the entire situation. That he hears the cry of the entire people of Israel as a collective, but also as an individual. And we see a God who meets us where we're at, a God who sees the injustice, who hears the cry of the poor, and who sees the abuses of power, and who speaks the truth. Again, science tells us that climate change is real. But faith tells us this matters because this is an issue that is close to the heart of Christ. And we see a God who invites us to have hope. Just as he did with Moses in slavery in Egypt, I believe that this also applies to the climate crisis that we're facing today, along with all the other issues that come attached. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and to bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will go with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses said to God rather, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what should I tell them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." Again, it is strange that the all-powerful God wouldn't reveal his name. He would tell us who he is. And yet at the same time, even though Moses, he's experiencing God, he's in all wonder of God, he still wrestles with his own limitations and lies of inadequacy. And the verse goes on, the next chapter goes on to talk about how Moses called himself mute and that he was not good at speaking. Further passages would indicate that he was actually a great speaker. So it's not clear whether or not he's actually believing lies of self-doubt and just inadequacy. And yet the funny thing is that despite Moses' own inadequacy, or feelings of inadequacy rather, that he's feeling in that moment, it's actually his own story that goes on to inspire the story of 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Sukkah in Judah. They pitched their camp at Ephes and Dammon, between Sukkah and Asekah. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out to the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet in his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and the bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. And Moses stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for a battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defile the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Comparable to today, we see in these verses a morally corrupt government, which was both unwilling and incapable of facing the problems that we have in these situations. But verse 12 picks up. Now David was a son of Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and Saul's time when he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons followed Saul to war. The first was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul. For 40 days the Philistines came forward every morning and every evening and took his stand. Early in the morning, David left the flock and the care of the shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to his battle positions, shouting the war cry. David asked the man standing near him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? They should defy the armies of the living God." That was when David overheard what was reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." And despite Saul's instinctive use of fear, David decides to speak truth to power and decides to have faith and act with courage. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When the lion or bear carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it and struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When he turned to me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened his sword over his tunic and tried walking on the armor, because he was not used to them. "I cannot go with these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. He took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, and put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag. With his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. In his commentary of 1 Samuel 17, Matthew Henry notes that Judges 20, verse 16, talks about the stone slingers of Israel, that there were 700 great stone slingers that, quote, they could shoot at a hair and not miss. David knew that he was good, but he had also grown up hearing these great stories, and he probably had to wrestle with this sense of whether or not he was the best. Further to that point, David was not even the oldest of his own brothers. He was not the most experienced with war. He was not the best trained with a sword and shield, but he had seen God's faithfulness protect him in the midst of danger. And David chose to have faith despite that danger and despite not being the best. In his book, Malcolm Gladwell talks about the various traits that make someone successful. He notes, as one of many examples, that people who have an IQ of above 120, you can no longer use IQ to statistically predict someone's level of success. Furthermore, there are American Nobel laureates who graduate from anywhere from Harvard to DePaul University. And so you don't have to be an Ivy League graduate to win a Nobel Prize. Gladwell and others have called this the threshold effect. Basically, you don't necessarily need to be the best. You just have to be equipped enough. Verse 41 continues. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was a little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. This very day I will carry the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And those who have gathered here know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Anytime I read this passage, I picture David as just absolutely panicking, that he's probably sweating profusely, and that he is deeply afraid. What makes David so courageous in this moment is not just the fact that he's willing to face this danger, but that at a very deep and real and at a very visceral level, he understands the gravity of the danger that he is in. The Bible doesn't talk about this, but I've always pictured in my mind that when David went to fight the bear and or the lion, that he probably was very close to being killed. He might have even gotten injured in those moments. David mentions God so many times because in that moment, that's the only thing he has to cling to. It's the only way that he can move past that sense of dread and just the overwhelming nature of the problem and that very real physical danger. And despite the circumstance that he is in, despite all that's happening, he goes back to that proverbial burning bush and he realizes that God is truly present and right there in that moment. David realizes that he is where God is and that there's nothing more than he would want than to be right where God is. David wants most to be where God is, and in this moment, it's in that battle with Goliath. David receives strength from God and is able to draw inspiration from God's past faithfulness, not only that which he's seen in his own life, but also that which he knows from the Israelite history. David is remembering in this moment how Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. And this isn't in the Bible, but rabbinic tradition actually has another angle to offer on this story. Now, according to the rabbinic tradition, what happens is that when Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt, they walked the Red Sea, and then they stopped right there because it was not parting. And the tribe leaders were arguing with each other about what to do, and then it was finally until Nishan stepped into the river, and he kept taking one step after another, and the Red Sea was still not parting. He took one step and then another, and it wasn't until the water had actually reached Nishan's nose that finally the Red Sea split. And I believe that David in that moment, I'm gonna suppose that in the moment, this is a story he has in mind. Rabbinic tradition goes on to tell us that Nishan was one of David's ancestors. David is also in this moment remembering the fact that in the very previous chapter, in 1 Samuel 16, the prophet Samuel went to David's house, did not anoint any of his other brothers that were older, stronger, and more fit, but that he was the one who was anointed. And I'm going to bet that in that moment that King David was anointed, he had no idea how it was going to happen. He just knew that God had said that he was going to be the king of Israel. Didn't make sense, and he didn't see it in that moment. And yet here now he sees that maybe that the way to becoming king is through this obstacle. Now, you can also look at this through another lens, hypothetically, and see that probably any of the other Israelites who were there for 40 days at the camp could have gone up and challenged him. David probably could have still been the king, and someone else could have taken down Goliath. And in this moment, that David is on the battlefield with Goliath, he has to trust God's faithfulness, just like he was faithful back then, trust that God is faithful to his word, and that he will still be king of Israel, even though he has this obstacle in front of him. Verse 48 continues. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. Notice here the one small yet very important detail. David, when he slung the stone, it hit Goliath in the forehead. But Goliath fell forward. Right? And I think the thing to note here is that if he had fell backward, the idea would be David knocked him down. He fell forward because God knocked down Goliath. Matthew 17 gives us a parallel story. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat and went to a deserted place by himself. But the multitudes heard it, and they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus saw a great multitude, he was moved with compassion for them. He healed their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him, saying, "This is a deserted place. The hour is nearly late. Send the multitudes away, they may go into their villages and buy themselves some food." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. give them something to eat." And they said to him, "We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish." He said to them, "Bring them to me." Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looking up to heaven. He blessed it and broke it. Some translations say he gave thanks. And gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. So they all ate, and they were filled. And they took up the baskets, and took up 12 full baskets, and fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Commentators will note that, again, as they were counting only men, at the time, that you could probably estimate this was more like 20,000 people when you include women and children. The passage continues with a parallel story. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed them, he went up to the mountain to pray by himself. Later that night, they were alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them. He walked on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, and cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And they climbed into the boat, and the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now, the story doesn't make clear how many steps Peter may have walked. Some have suggested that this could have been 2 steps. It could have been 100 steps. That the story doesn't make this clear. But here's what is clear: that in any situation, the minute God enters that situation and walks into the room, that situation has become fundamentally different, simply because God has entered that situation or that room. In these stories, we see Moses, David, the boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Peter give God what they had to give, and God does what they cannot. And the point I'd like to make here is that God has us right where he wants us, and that he just asks that we do what we can. And I can look back on my own story, and I see some of these parallels, with the biblical stories and with my own, and I can see this in my own steps towards working in climate and international development. So, in a sense, my own story begins in my senior year, 26. So I graduated in 2017, but this began in 2016. As it's no secret to any of you, this is the year that the current president was first elected. And for me, this caused a crisis of faith. I've always been a Christian. I've always believed in God. But I grew up in a church that I felt was very healthy, felt very connected to. But when the current president came, when he ran for president and he won, I saw as many within my home church in Michigan decided to support him, and I felt very betrayed. And it wasn't just the support of him, it was the magnification of him. It was him taking center stage and Christ taking a side role, kind of being pushed to the background per se. And this began a journey for me of starting to reevaluate what it is I believe and why. At the same time, I was getting ready to go to college. I got a 22, 25, and 23 on the ACT, and that meant I was not going to Harvard or Yale, as I'd always thought I would go in all sincerity. And I was very disappointed at the time to go to Oakland University. I ended up having a great time there, but initially I was very disappointed. I grew up 15 minutes away from this place, and I'd imagine I would have gone further. It was then that I decided to study actuarial science and theater. And I had a lot of people who tried to convince me otherwise. I had academic counselors tell me to definitely not do both together, and to not do actuarial science and to go for a different career which was less academically demanding. I even had people close to me try to dissuade me, and I even had a calculus high school professor tell me that I wasn't ready for this. And yet I decided to take that step of faith. I decided to study actuarial science. And much to the credit of the people who tried to dissuade me, it was very, undergraduate was a very demanding, and it was a very challenging time, both personally and academically. And I failed a Calculus 2 class, and I also failed a statistics class. And during this time, I also really had to grapple with just this sense that, again, I felt betrayed. I felt betrayed by other Christians around me, and I felt that this phenomenon would be an obstacle to what God wanted to do. I would look at others and say, God, why are you letting this happen? They're getting in your way. They're not letting you do what you want to do. And it was during this time that I was an undergraduate that I started to find out about the World Bank in my first year as an undergraduate student. I started to learn more about the sheer severity and the urgency of the climate crisis, as well as just the capabilities of artificial intelligence and just how vital that was going to be to the future. And it was in 2018 that I decided that I wanted to work at the World Bank. It was in 2019 finally that I began to feel more integrated. I started to find a new community of faith, and one where the faith felt fresh again. It was no longer that Christ had again become center stage. I felt God had brought a lot of healing into my life in 2019. But I think you all remember 2020. And this is a time that, like the pandemic, many of us experienced loss, whether it be the loss of financial loss, personal loss, the loss of someone close to us. Different kind of loss for me, but I gained weight, I lost hair, and it was also a time of just being alone. And having friendships that I began to value, and an internship in France that was no longer going to be there. In 2021, I finally graduated with my bachelor's in actuarial science and a minor in theater. And I got to look at this as a monument of what God had done in my life. Of me giving God my 5 loaves, my 2 fish, of me slinging the stone, but God knocking down the giant. But I also had to say that I was still carrying some of that hurt. And I'd faced the bear, but now it's time to face the lion. And I decided I had to go to get my master's in DC. You really can't get into the World Bank without a master's or a doctorate. So I knew this was the next step. And again, I had even someone close to me who tried to dissuade me from coming here to Washington, D.C., and I had an undergraduate professor tell me that I was not ready for a master's in data science. Now, fast forward 2 years, and I did graduate with a master's in data science. I got an undergraduate GPA of 3.2. I graduated with a graduate GPA of 3.9. And so, I was very excited. I was ready to finally jump in and finally do the work that I was passionate about. And that's when the job search began. And it took me 5 months to even find a job. And during this time, I moved back to Michigan, where I grew up, and I remember just feeling stuck. It was my first time being in a really elongated period of wait, and just thinking to myself, I really put in the effort. I went for it. I gave God my 5 loaves and 2 fish. Where's that miracle? And this is the truth, right? I mean, these biblical stories, I hate to say, are kind of swayed, because these are not the stories where these are the stories where we see God work a miracle. And there's plenty of stories, I'm sure, in the lives of people that we know where God doesn't work the miracle. He either doesn't work the miracle that we want, He doesn't work the miracle that we ask for, He doesn't work the miracle in the way He worked. And then finally, after 5 months, I landed a job with the Navy, which was a great opportunity, where I got to do good work. And yet there was a part of me that, if I'm being completely sincere, felt like it was a compromise. And it felt like it was a compromise because I wasn't working in climate, I wasn't working in international development, and I wanted to keep pursuing my dreams. Now, for a number of circumstances, I ended up getting fired from my position. I was hired into a position as a data scientist, which was then quickly transitioned to a position as a computer scientist and autonomous drone navigation engineer. There was a lack of fit, and my former team lead ended up being investigated by the U.S. government. To this day, I don't know the extent of that story, but I do know that. I can say that there were some occurrences in that workplace that were suspect, and there could be reasons why he was investigated. And here I was again, in the place I'd been just a year before. It took me 5 months to find a job, and 7 for it to actually begin, simply because the clearance process takes that time. And here I was again looking for a new job. And yet this time I thought to myself, no, this is the time to really go for what I want. This is the time to pursue my calling again. So what happened was that the thing to note here was that I was fired on November 1st, 2024. And for me, it was difficult being fired. And then when the current president was reelected, that for me was devastating. And we've all seen the trickle effects that this has had on the climate crisis and this has had on development. It's created a very stressful moment. And yet it was in this season that I was then able to go to a finance workshop where I got to meet the person who started the green and sustainable bonds. Heike Reckled from the World Bank essentially created her own financial instrument in a little market. It was then in that season that I was able to go to the World Bank on December 18th. I competed in a hackathon for data scientists, and my team, not through my efforts, but my team won first place. I was able to meet someone there who was a senior position at the World Bank, and he said, "Max, we want to develop you." It was around this time as well that I started on a daily basis just writing a few notes about what God was doing. I would say God provided for all my needs. This happened, that happened, and I also started writing the days. I started to walk in a circle around the World Bank. Dr. Mark Batterson is a New York Times bestselling author, and he has a book called The Circle Maker. Basically, you walk in a circle around the things that you are praying for. And it felt very awkward at first, but I said I'm going to go to the World Bank and pray in a circle around it. It was awkward the first day, but what I quickly realized was that it's a very transited area because this is 18H and 19 and G, and so this is if you go and walk a lap around there, it's pretty inconspicuous. And then finally on March 11th, I got the email that I was hired in as a short-term consultant and in a data scientist role at the World Bank. And this would take me 4 months of waiting, and the previous season of waiting had prepared me for this. And notice here a number of things. Number one, the World Bank has about 10 different buildings. I ended up working in the building which I prayed in. Second of all, this is the exact moment when there has been a lot of stress, when morale has been low. As some of you here in this room, I've been to the climate conferences recently. I've been to them the last few years, and networking events and climate-related events, and it's different. This is the whole reason why I even put on this talk. Was I thought to myself, we need to have a moment, just talk about morale and talk about where the situation is at. And I get to be now in a role with the procurement team, which is not only central to the World Bank's function, but also central to the World Bank's sustainability and climate action efforts. And at the time, I didn't know this, that God had been guiding my steps years before. I didn't know in that moment. I didn't know this 10 years ago when I started taking French lessons in school. I would be using this today. I'm greatly encouraged by just everything that God has done in our lives. But I also want to take a moment to talk about just all the great opportunities that God is giving us. When it comes to technological innovation, we're seeing a lot of great growth and a lot of great developments. Any one of these topics, you can dive really deep and investigate each one of these. I want to draw some specific attention to some of my personal favorites, and that is the X Prize Foundation and the work they do in spurring technological innovation. For those of you who don't know, the X Prize Foundation hosts technological innovation incentive prizes where entrepreneurs and startups compete and they develop technology that is market ready. Now, a few examples would be like the $100 million carbon removal prize. Just to name a few examples, you have WhaleX, who develops synthetic whale feces. Yes, that's right. Fake whale poop. The reason being because this is a nutrient. When you have a shortage of whales, it is the nutrients from their feces or poop that the phytoplankton feed on, and then that way that kickstarts the ecosystems. So if you have a shortage of whales, but you can emulate their feces and the whale patterns, you can restart those ecosystems, and then the coral reefs are then also revitalized, and they can store excess carbon dioxide. Other examples include Silicate, who uses they use concrete waste, and then they use this to accelerate the weathering process, and also as nutrients for soil that also accelerate the carbon removal process. You also have another example in ZS2 Technologies, and they have a proprietary concrete mixing technique that as you're creating concrete and building, you're actually using that concrete to store excess carbon dioxide. You also have other technologies outside of carbon removal, notably in rainforest preservation and also in wildfire management, prevention, and detection. Here in our backyards, just a few blocks down the road, you have a company like N5 Sensors that they use automatic and cloud-powered technology to detect wildfires. You also have Limelight Rainforest that they're using autonomous drones to both manage biodiversity and also to allocate irrigation. And there's further technologies that are that can be used for not only climate change but also for climate resilience. And you can use CRISPR technologies and gene editing to bring back extinct species and to revitalize ecosystems. And and then obviously there's probably one of the big ones that we're all thinking about. So, we'll get there in just a second. The way I really came to notice the magnitude that we're all seeing now was I was an undergrad, and I literally just Google searched what are the world's biggest problems. This article has been updated since, and I'll tell you in a moment why. But the 80,000 Hours research group said that, listed the top 10 biggest problems, and it starts out at 10, 9, and 8, right? I scrolled through this list, and it made a lot of sense. And then I got to number 2. Number 2 was climate change. And I, at the time, was actually very surprised. Climate change, with its enormity, with the $143 billion it costs us on a global level, and more, how is this the number 2 problem? And then you scroll down to number 1, and that was AI, right? The reason why this same article from the 80,000 Hours research group has been updated was because they have now broken up like the top 7 problems into different kinds of AI problems. Climate change has now moved down to 9 on that list, weirdly enough. And I understand that artificial intelligence it's its own topic, and it's a very vast topic with a lot of subcategories. And especially when you also add in quantum computing, there's so much to talk about there. Whether it's the ethical use of AI, data centers, and excessive compute. But I do want to draw attention two key points. Number one, the artificial intelligence will continue to increase exponentially in its intelligence level. We'll put it to you this way. If a rat is number one, and if Einstein is at a 2, artificial intelligence can reach 80 by, say, the year 2050. Even that might be an underestimate. And second of all, and this is the one that really impacts all these fields of technological innovation and more. Again, this list is not comprehensive. Carbon removal, clean energy, water, decarbonization of industries, gene modification, wildfire management. Again, there's broader, climate action and climate tech is broader than that. But the key thing here is that artificial intelligence is expected to discover new physics before the end of 2026. I understand that that's Elon Musk who said that, and at times he's been ambitious with his timelines. But if that is true, then this has ramifications for material science, and that means that all these technologies will reshape industries as we know it. And it's good to have, and for as timely and as potent as all these technologies are, and as useful as they all are, I'm looking at these, and these are some excellent stones to have in our slingshots. Don't get me wrong. And yet, I want to take a moment to look at Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. In his book, he talks about extensively the hero's journey and the cosmogonic cycle, both, the journey the hero goes through, and then the cycle that the hero's world is in. And in this book, A Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell draws, parallels from all different hero myths, from all different cultures and times. Key points to note from this is that the hero leaves his world, enters a new world, brings a new tool or power, and then comes back to his world, saves it, and becomes the master of two worlds. So for as great as the aforementioned technologies are, I want to propose something. That the greatest possible hero's journey is not just through leveraging a specific technology, whether it be wildfire management, whether it be cloud, AI, quantum computing, whether it be gene editing. All excellent stones in our slingshots. But the greatest possible hero's journey is being in the presence of God. The greatest possible hero's journey is to just stand before God, the all-powerful, all-good, perfectly just and loving God, who is not just out there, but who's here with us in space and time, in the middle of the situations that we find ourselves in, at the personal, at the political, and international levels, and a God who meets us where we are. And I believe that that's the greatest possible hero's journey. That the power of the stone does not come from itself. That the stone is mundane. But that its power comes from centripetal force, and that its impact comes from the one who slings it. And, in his book, Malcolm Gladwell, again, in Outliers, he talks about different traits that make successful people successful. A number of traits are listed, but I want to key in on a few different people. Bill Joy and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates are some of the most notable names in all of tech. I'll tell you Bill Joy's birthday. Bill Joy was born on November 8th, 1954. Steve Jobs was born on February 24th, 1955. Bill Gates was born on October 28th, 1955. These three men were all born in a 12-month window. He goes on to elaborate more about their stories, that you had to be at a certain moment in time where you were just young enough to catch the technological wave, but not too old as well. You had to have been born in that window. and you had to have had the opportunities they were given. And in short, I read a book like this, and I see a God who is guiding their steps, and who is and all they did was they simply responded to do what they could. And I want to take all this, whether it be King David being on the battlefield, Moses being at the burning bush, whether it's us having these technological breakthroughs and just the overall circumstance that we're in, and look at this moment now, right? God doesn't work the miracles until we face the brutal facts. Whether that be David versus Goliath, Moses leading the people out of Israel, looking at a crowd of 20,000 people, 5,000 men, as the Bible says, the 20,000 with including men and women, saying, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And we can look at this, and we can look at the climate crisis and international development. And, God doesn't work the miracle until we face the brutal facts. And the Bible also tells us that God's the one who directs our paths. That if we trust in the Lord with all our heart and lean not on our understandings, in our ways acknowledge Him, He directs our paths. That God withholds no good thing which we pray for, if it is within His will. That if we have faith the size of a mustard seed, that He can move a mountain. And how fitting also that He's also the one who can calm the winds and waves. Much like we see with climate change. And I believe is that when we throw the stone, that He knocks down the giant. That is when what T.S. Eliot says that, and at the end of all our exploring, we will arrive. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. And I believe that place is the presence of God Almighty. And I want to leave you all with a challenge today. The challenge I make to myself, that I do what I can. That God has placed me where He's placed me, and He's the one who's guiding my paths, and I'll give Him what I can. Right? I have the stones in my sling. Right? As someone who writes code, who works with statistics, and who's retooling, recently started learning quantum computing. That you take this stone, put it in your sling, and you go for it. God's the one who knocks down the giant. We come back to the place to know for the first time, and we see a God who's taken down this giant that is climate change, this giant that is global extreme poverty, and all that remains is just God. Thank you all for coming to my message. I also, want to thank Bethesda Green, Sharon, and Dave, and all who helped me with this. I also want to thank Joelle from Interfaith Power Online. I want to thank each of you for coming today. Thank you all.